This is really meant to be a little more interactive, just to talk about mind space and about the potential. And remember, if you can't see business, you'll never be able to get business. And so one of the huge things that we always talk about is being able to see business. So and really what I wanted to do is do a comparison contrast between advertising versus educational sales and really accentuate the magnitude of the opportunity. I want to show the reality of these opportunities. So having said that, let's talk about this, and some of you guys have heard this to some degree, maybe not the degree we're going to talk about it right now, but to some degree. And so let's go into that right now, if you don't mind, which is opportunity, new patient opportunity. So where's the new patient opportunity? And I remember when I just got out of chiropractic school, there'd be some of these older doctors, they'd say, oh, there's new patients everywhere. There's one there, and they just point at people. There's one there, and and I didn't quite get it. I didn't understand what they were doing or what they were talking about. I'm like, yeah, but how do you get them? And that's what everybody wants to know, is how to get business. That's when you become the CEO, is when you know how to get and keep business. So that's what I want to just go into, the statistical comparison of the difference between advertising and educational sales right now for just a few minutes before we go into this next category. And this is really opportunity. And if you can see this opportunity, it really shows you how unlimited, and in other words, how you can get more business than you physically can handle. And if you never understand this, if you never see it, then you'll never get more business than you physically can handle. That's really the bottom line about this. Let's look at the advertising formula for a second here. So we know that only 8% of the population is utilizing chiropractic care. So we go 8%. And remember, what we're doing here is looking at opportunity. And of course, we fill in the specifics of this opportunity, but this is to create clarity and contrast between the market and where there's real opportunity, and how there's real opportunity, and where there's huge opportunity. And so when we look at 8% of the market, so remember that's 8% of the people that are looking for chiropractic care. So you go, okay, if an average doctor, let's say that, and remember, an average doctor with decent efficiencies can usually see between about 25 new patients a month, really between 20 and 30. If the worse you are at effectively processing patients, then the more new patients you're going to need. In other words, the lower your retention. The better your retention, the more effective you are, then the less new patients you're going to need to maximize your time before you physically can't see any more business. So if we say 25, and so the number is really between 20 and 30, those are the two efficiency markers. And so if we say 25 new patients a month, 25 new patients a month is 300 new patients a year. So that's how many new patients you would need if your patient retention was 20 or greater, to essentially max out to where you would not be able to physically see any more people yourself. And that's where you would be seen anywhere between 150 a week to 250 a week. And again, that depends on your retention, whether if it's in the low end of 20 or the higher end of 35 in that functional capacity model. So if we're looking at 300 new patients a year, and there's an 8% utilization, well, how many patients, potential patients, would you have to be in front of? And let's say from an advertising standpoint, how many patients would you have to be in front of from advertising? And this is if it was just a direct one-to-one relationship. In other words, somebody was actually looking and they chose you. So at 8% utilization, how many people would you have to be in front of? So, and if any of you guys have these numbers, go ahead and say the numbers out loud. Okay. So if you're at 5,000, that's 400. You'd have to be at 5,000 be at 400. So if you're at 4,000, that's 320. So 4,000 is 320. So, it might be, well, let's just keep the numbers rounded off. So your advertising would have to be in front of 4,000 people for you to get for 8%. And again, that's if you're going to get all 8% within your geographic radius of draw. And remember, you are limited by your geographic radius of draw. So having said that, that's like best case scenario. So your marketing message and to get 100% of that, and chances are you're not going to get 100% of all 8% of the people that are looking for chiropractors in your geographic area. There's going to be some that are going to go to other chiropractors. So let's go to the next level. So let's say it's at 100% right now. And so you're at 4,000 people you got to be in front of. Your marketing message has to be in front of 4,000 people. In other words, you got to pay. Now, we're talking about advertising. In other words, being in front of I'm not talking about referrals, none of that. I'm talking about advertising. So where you're using advertising to get more of the patients who are actually looking for you. And what we're doing is just doing a comparison contrast between advertising and educational sales just to show you opportunity and where this opportunity lies. And so your advertising message would have to be in front of 4,000 people. That's if 100% of those people came to you and they came to you on the first contact. Okay? So let's say that your competition, I don't know what your competition is. You take your radius of draw, divide it by the number of chiropractors into your population, and that gives you your ratio of competition. In my office, in my geographic area of draw, I had a population of 3,000, and there were 4 chiropractors in a population of 3,000. So we had under 1,000 population. Optimally, we'd like to have it, when I open offices, I always optimally like to have it over 3,000. I like to have my radius of draw over 3,000 when I opened offices with doctors who were just not as good, not as skillful, and knowledgeable. So, but that's what my ratios was 3 population 3,000. 4 other chiropractors, and I had 2 full-time associates seeing over 300 patient visits a week. That did not happen from advertising. So let's say your competition, I don't know, let's say if it was a 4-to-1 ratio, in other words, you got on a 4-to-1 ratio, and that's probably still a pretty high ratio. Most chiropractors on this call probably have a ratio, I don't know, of anywhere from 4 to 8 to 1 probably. But if it's a 4-to-1 ratio, so if you multiply that times 4, so that's 4 times 4, that's 16,000 people or eyeballs you'd have to be in front of over that year to capture those 300 new patients. And that's also suggesting that they act the first time they see you, okay? So, and we know that some of the basic rules of marketing is generally people don't act the first time they see you from advertising. So that's 16,000 people that you've got to get in front of at a 4-to-1 ratio to get in front of 4,000 people to capture 25% of those people, which are the 8%ers that are looking for chiropractors. And so what is your likelihood of getting in front of 16,000 people? And what's the cost going to be? Well, let's do some leverage of time. Let's talk a little bit about leverage of time and go, okay, if you're doing mall screenings, which is the worst type of way to get new business, it's a cold call, and you don't know if there's a need or not. And and there's no need and there's no trust. So if you're doing that kind of business, you got to run through a lot of people. You got to run through, that's a lot of effort to try to find. And now, again, we're talking about advertising. If you know educational sales, that's a whole nother story. But that's not what we're talking about yet. We're talking about people that are passing your booth who are actually proactively looking for a chiropractor at that particular time. And by the way, that also is if it's divided into 12 months. And so let's say we divide that over 12 months. In other words, there was 30 new patients over a month, as opposed to dividing it over, 52 weeks in a year, or roughly 260 business days in a year, business days. So these numbers just keep going up and up. And so you can see why it's I don't know, in 20 plus years of practicing, I don't know of anybody who has ever maximized his time for money. In other words, couldn't see more business, and he only did advertising. I don't know of anybody who's advertised their way to wealth. I don't know of anybody in the chiropractic profession. And remember, that's one of the reasons why there's no franchises in chiropractic. There's no pure franchises like McDonald's or Burger King, is because the percentage of people that are utilizing it is just too small. And so if you don't have anybody in that franchise who doesn't know educational sales, you're only limited to a very, very small number, 8% in a small geographic radius. And then that's divided by everybody else you're competing with. And that's why franchises don't exist in small percentages of industries. So there has to be a large percentage of people utilizing a product or service before you can do a franchise and only expect advertising to bring people in. In other words, nobody in that business has to know sales. Nobody in McDonald's knows sales. I guarantee you that. It's all advertising and branding. So that's one example of how many people. So 16,000 people, that's a lot of people in different ways. So let's do a contrast of educational sales. Okay, what's the opportunity with educational sales? And this is where it comes in when I talked about, when I first got out of school, and I remember this older guy would say, oh, there's new patients everywhere. There's one. Well, this is what he was talking about, but he didn't know how to explain it. I do. So if you look at that population and you go, okay, if you look at a population base and you go, okay, subtract out the 8%, that leaves the 92%. And then we know out of that, and we're going to use the same number. We're going to use that 16,000 number. And then out of that 92%, we know 25% of them don't have what's called a gateway. They don't have a need for what you do. I mean, if you don't have a BMW and there's a BMW service dealer right around your corner, it doesn't matter. You're not going to go visit him and pay him time or money. So 25% don't have back or neck pain. So that leaves roughly 68% of the population who does. So if you take 68% of that number, so you go 16,000, what was that number, 16,000? That was the number we had to get in front of for advertising. So if you take 16,000 and then you multiply that, 16,000.68%, 16,000 times 0.68. That's 10,000 people, almost 11. 10,800 people. Let's just round it to 11. That's 11,000 potential patients. 11,000 where zero existed before. Zero. Now, remember, those people are not looking for a chiropractor. Now, the next category, which is real important, and I'm going to actually break this down into a real specific video, is, okay, out of those 11,000 people that are potential patients, you have to be familiar with the scale. Remember, they have a need to some degree of your problem, whether it's back pain, neck pain, headaches. And remember, they're doing something to some degree, typically, and I will put this on a video because, how you see this, and remember, every patient, every human being that I see, this is how I saw them. So when a new patient came in my office, this is how I saw the new patient. This is how I looked at their spouse. This is how I looked at their kids. This is how I looked at their circle of influence, their best friend, coworker, and their family members. This is exactly how I viewed every one of those patients, and that allowed me to understand and made it much easier for me to get those patients when none of them were looking, or very, very small percentage of them, 8% were actually looking for chiropractors within a year. Well, I couldn't wait around. You can't wait around for 8%, you'll go broke. So 11,000 potential people. Now remember, we removed the 8%. Did we remove the 8%? No, we didn't. So let's remove the 8% from the 16,000. So we got 16,000. Let's remove the 8%. And that's 1,200 roughly. So just break it down to 15. So we're not talking about a whole lot of difference here. So 15,000 times 0.25. So take out another, say, 37,400 or 4,000. So we started with 16. So we take out the 8%, which was 1,200 roughly, and then take out the 25%, which is 37. So we'll just round that off to 4. So between both of them, rounding up and down, we'll say 5,000. 5 from 16 is 11,000. So that's where we're at. We got 11,000 potential new patients where we had none with advertising, none. And so now we go, okay, well, how do we look at that? We go, okay, how do you get what's the potential to get those from educational sales? Well, this is where you have to look at, and I kind of call it the 80-20 or the 80-10-10 model. Out of those 11,000 potential people, remember 10% of them have a very, very high need. And again, if we say on a scale of 1 to 10, and let's say 8, 9, and 10 is getting somebody to act. An 8 or 9 or 10 out of 10 gets them to actually act. And let's say a 1, 2, or 3 is very low, and then a 3, 4, and 5, and 6, right in the middle, is kind of in that middle range. Well, you have to remember that this is like a bell curve. Those 11,000 people are like a bell curve, and so the very beginning of the bell curve, as it's coming up, in other words, there's the top slice of the bell curve that has real high need. Real high need. I mean, they're going to the emergency room. They're driving right by your office, going right to the emergency room. They're going to surgery. They're going to the orthopedist. I mean, the neurologist. These are high need people. So you have to think, out of this 11,000 people, there's a small percent at the top that's real high need. There's a small percent, another 10% at the bottom, that's real low need. And this is real important to understand in educational sales. That just because you're looking at somebody that, in other words, if I look at somebody, the first thing I'm going to do is whatever somebody or group, I'm going to go, okay, 8% of them will move over here. They're going to act within 12 months. Take that piece out of the pie. That's a small number, so we take that out. And then the remainder, I'm going to take out the 25% who have no back pain, neck pain, headaches, that don't have a gateway. Because if they try to get them in through a non-gateway, that's a paradigm shift. You don't get them. By the way, most of you guys already know, out of the non-gateways, 4 out of 5 of non-gateway problems come in from referrals, not from advertising, because it's a paradigm shift. So you took out the 8%, we took out the 25%. Now we have roughly that 68% of the total number. And out of that number, we said, and the number we used as we compared it to advertising was 16,000, so we're down to 11,000 after we subtracted all the numbers. We got 11,000 potential people. And how does that break down? Well, this is how, and this is so important to understand this with educational sales. 10% of those people, you can be an idiot and get them as patients because the need is so high. I mean, you can just be really bad at educational sales. And remember, the core of educational sales is need relative to obstacles, relative to trust. So, I mean, just if you were just in a trusted environment, you would get that business if there was more trust versus less trust, just because the need's so high. Or if you minimize the obstacle a little bit, not even a lot, you would get that potential business. So, but that's a small number, and this is what I'm trying to be emphatic about with educational sales. It's a small number. In other words, knowing how to compartmentalize this. Because if you know how to compartmentalize it, you know how to attack it. In other words, get it as a business. So 10% is going to be ridiculously easy. That's going to fall in your lap every now and then. In other words, they're not looking for a chiropractor, but it'll be a trusted relationship, and you'll say maybe, or just the trusted relationship alone lowers the defenses and gets them to act because there's a high enough need. Remember, the need's already there. Now, let's go to the other side of that. But that's only 10%, and that is what is so important to understand with educational sales. Now, let's go to the flip side of that. 10% of that 68% or those 11,000 people have very, very low need. It's like a 1, 2, or 3. In other words, it's not affecting their ADLs as much. They're not taking as much medication or over-the-counter or limiting their activities as much. So it's a very low number. Now, what's so important to understand about that number is that's very difficult. Even if you're really good at educational sales, those people are really difficult, even if they're through introductions. And then where's the core, where's there a massive amount of business? In other words, on that lower 10% on a scale of 1 to 10, they're 1, 2, or 3. But the good news about that is it's a very small percentage of the people who have a problem. That's the good news. There's also a small percentage of people that you don't have to be very knowledgeable and very much educational sales. That's the other top 10%. So there's a top 10 and a lower 10, and that's the good and bad news about that top 10 and the lower 10. But that's not, again, where the big numbers are. The big numbers right there in the middle, the sweet spot. That's that 80% number. And what has to happen with that 80% number, and this is the analogy that I give over and over and over. This is the sweet spot of where massive amount of business is. Doesn't matter if it's new patients, personal injury attorneys. This is where the sweet spot of new business is. And if you can't see it, and if you can't break it down, it just makes it that much more difficult to access it. And so that 80% is the core now. What do you have to do to that group, that core? Well, remember, we preferably want that core to be in a trusted category. And remember, there's only 5 introduction categories. There's only 5. Spouse, child, best friend, coworker, family members, close family members, brother, father, mother, sister. And then your VIPs, your 20%ers that have shown to refer business. Those are your only 5 introduction categories. So we prefer to have them come from that category because remember the 3 components we're always looking at leveraging is need relative to obstacles, relative to trust. So if I'm already in that trusted category, that's going to significantly help me. And by the way, that alone will help you get a lot more of that 10%, the high need people. But it'll make it a hell of a lot easier with that 80% in the middle. because their defenses and resistance are down, and they're going to be more receptive to what you're saying or talking about. So that is a major factor. If I go out back into, let's say, a cold call market. So let's say I'm talking to 10, 20 people. I don't know them. They don't know me. I don't know if they have a need, back pain, neck pain, aches, and there's no trust. Well, that's going to be a much more difficult market than that introduction market. So here's my point with this 80% is that 80% is where the gold's at. This is where all the gold's at. And knowing this, understanding it, and having the skill to do it is tremendous business. And this is how I was able to open office after office after office, new patients after new patients after new patients. Is that 80% is there? You have to look at this ratio of need relative to obstacles. Remember, at the core of the purchase is the need relative to obstacles by trust. So all I'm going to try to do is take their perceived need. Now remember, their perceived need is either a 4, 5, 6, or 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. It's a 4, 5, 6, or 7. Remember, if it's a 1, 2, or 3, the lowest 10%, those are very difficult to move up and increase their need. If they're at the high, 8, 9, or 10, it's very easy to get those people. But that both of the high and the low are small numbers. The one in the middle is the massive amount of people and numbers. So all I need to do is get that group in the middle, get their perceived need. If it's a 4, I just need to get it to a 5 or 6. If it's a 5, I just want to get it to a 6 or 7. If it's a 7, I just want to get it to an 8 or 9 in their awareness. That's all I want to do. And you won't be able to take it from a 7 to a 10 or from a 4 to a 10. You will not be able to do that. And it's only if you only be able to affect the awareness in educational sales a couple notches. Now obviously the better you are, the more notches. If you're not good at educational sales at all, you won't be able to touch their perceived need. You won't be able to affect it at all if you have no skill or knowledge. If you're really good, you can increase it 3 or 4 or even 5. You can totally max it out if you're really good. Most doctors aren't. And so what I say is just try to take it 2 notches. And so think of the thermometer scale. And so, this is how you look at every patient, whether it's a spouse, whether it's the child, whether it's the circle of influence, whether it's a brother, father, mother, sister, whether it's everybody. This is how I look at them. And this is how they're broken down psychologically. And it tells me exactly how I need to be communicating with this person to get him as a patient. And so I'm going to see real quick through my dialogue, is it a high need person? Is it a 8, 9, or 10? Or is it a 1, 2, or 3? I'm going to see that real quick. And not in this video, but later we explain how to do this. And then remember, in that middle 80%, we want to increase their need. And remember, you always have to talk about need before you talk about time or money. If they bring time or money up, you cannot talk about it. You have to put it on hold. You can never, and this is a rule, you can never, ever talk about money or time before there's need. Never. That is a written in stone rule. So you have to learn that even when you start talking with somebody and they come back and say, well, what does it cost? Or does it accept my insurance? You have to learn not to jump there. And that's a skill set. That's active listening and a skill set. So you always have to establish need first before. And if they bring up time or money, you have to put them on hold, go to need, and then come back to time or money. Remember, when there's low or no need, it doesn't matter what you say with time or money. It's not going to be very good. And so the analogy that I like to say is I like to think of it as a teeter-totter. You just want to get the teeter-totter of the perceived need higher than the perceived obstacles, and so the water flows. Water flows meaning action. They take an action step. What's an action step? They come into your office. Remember, the only goal when somebody's outside is to get them in the office for day one. That's called present time consciousness. That's the only goal. Nothing else. We don't talk about anything else. So the whole goal is just to create a teeter-totter effect. All we want to do with the needs relative to the obstacles is increase the perceived needs, because right now it's this way. They're not acting. What we want to do is shift it a little bit this way to get them to act. And this is how it's done. So we establish need, we shift, so we take that big chunk, if it's that 80th percentile, and let's say there are 4, 5, 6, or 7, we want to just notch it up 2 notches, say a 4 to a 6, a 5 to a 7, 7 to a 9, whatever. You get the idea. You won't get it to a 10, generally speaking. The other side of the equation, so after we've done this, and I quantify this, I tell you exactly what to say, how to say it, quantify it, and I tell you never to move past this until they say this. So now you know, because if they don't say this, you can't go to that. That's educational sales. So we quantify it literally, phrase by phrase by phrase. So you now know what to say and do here, here, and here to get their need here. Now, once their need is here and they've answered this question appropriately, then we come over and we minimize the obstacles of money first, time second, because those are the 2 obstacles. So that's the ratio. So that's when we go into decreasing. So all we're wanting to do is do this to that 80%. That's it. That is it, to get them to take the first step. Remember, we're not trying to get them to take 2 steps, not 3 steps, not 4, not 5. We're not going to talk about treatment programs. I saw that on one of the clients here on the call here. I saw his sign. It said treatment plans. I said, get that off your sign as fast as possible. Remember, you're talking about people in the outside world, not internal referrals who already may have a need. Talking about outside people to come in. Already, when it said treatment plans on his sign, he increased the perceived obstacle of money. People don't say there's treatment plans, or it was membership plans. That's what it was. It wasn't treatment plans. It was membership plans. I think it was membership plans. But it doesn't matter if there's treatment plans or membership plans. That phrase says it costs money. It costs more money. And so when you're using that phrase, treatment plans and membership plans, you're increasing their obstacles, decreasing the likelihood of them coming in. That's what you're doing. It's a counter effect. So after we've taken the educational sales and we moved it up a couple notches, then we come over and we address money first. Not time, money. We address money first. Then after money is agreed upon, then we go and get agreements on time. And that's how you get a tremendous amount of business. And so when you go out on the street, just look out on the street tomorrow when you go to lunch and look at all those people. They fit somewhere in these brackets that I'm telling you about. All those people that you see in McDonald's or wherever you go. There's 8% of them within a year that's going to be calling a chiropractor. You can't wait around for that to happen, though. Then out of the rest of that, take out that 8%, and then you got the 92%. And then out of that 92%, take 25% out. They don't have a perceived need for your services, back pain, neck pain, headaches. That leaves 68% of the whole group, or 69% of the whole group. So that's roughly 7 out of 10 people, 6 to 7 out of 10 people that represents that big bulk of new patients that I'm talking about. That's where there's huge. This is what I keep talking about. There's 2 different lakes in chiropractic. There's a real small lake, the 8%, where 95% of the chiropractors are fishing out of. So you got a small amount of fish, and you got a shitload of chiropractors trying to get the fish out of there. Competing against each other, and it's a very limited geographic area. That's a death knoll. You don't want to be any part of that. And then there's this other huge lake, that's completely stocked. That's called the 92%, or when we take out the 25%, now you're in the total number, you're at about 70%. You got a tremendous amount of business there, and very few chiropractors sitting around that lake fishing. Very, very few. And there's tremendous opportunity. And so that's the difference. So when you go to McDonald's tomorrow for lunch, and that's how I kind of look at business, is I'll go, okay, 8% of these people within a year they'll be looking for a chiropractor. Take out 25%. That leaves me this bulk number. All I have to do with that bulk number now, that 80%, it fits into the bell curve I was telling you about. All I have to do is be aware there's a small number in that 80% that I don't have to say a whole lot relative to need or obstacles to get them in. There's that's the top 10%. There's a low 10% that's going to be very, very difficult to get them because the need is so small. And then there's this massive amount right in the middle that's a 4, 5, 6, or 7 on a scale of 10. But their obstacles are greater than the 4 or 5. So all you're trying to do is get them up 2 notches and then take their obstacles down 2 notches. That's all you're trying to do. So if this was the need side and this was the obstacle, all I'm trying to do to that target market is go from a 4 to a 6 and maybe the obstacles from a 7 to a 5. And I got them. That's how I get that business. Or if they're a 5, I try to go from the need from a 5 to a 7 and the obstacles from a 7 to a 5. Or from a 6, you get the idea. All I'm doing is just 2 notches. That's it. But it's a relationship. It's 2 factors. It's need plus obstacles of time and money. And if you were to do a comparison of which is most important, it's easily 80 to 90% money over time. Easily. But you always want to handle both. But out of the 2, it's not 50-50. I'm not going to put the same amount of emphasis on money as I am with time. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pay a lot of attention, 90% of it, on money, and then another 10 to 20% on time. Now, obviously, if that dynamic of communication happened in a higher trust category, everything I just said is easier. Everything. If you're talking about a spouse, the children, significant other, brother, father, sister, or the VIPs, all of them are significantly easier. If you take that same, if you go out to a cold call environment, remember the different categories of marketing. Cold call is the worst potential. Leads are the second. And remember, well, the best is always the introductions. The 5 introduction systems are always the best to either do advertising or educational sales. And then there's the active referrals. So you get 75%. You'll get as much as 75% using educational sales in the introduction category. In active referrals, you can get as much as 55%. And remember, passive referrals is only about 3 to 7% passive referrals. That's why you can't wait around for passive referrals either. Leads are about 15%. Cold calls are 1%. So that's why you always want to start it. So I just wanted to create some clarity with this vision. And so when that chiropractor said to me, there's patients everywhere, he didn't understand how it worked. He didn't understand the relationship of need relative to obstacles, time or money, relative to trust. He didn't know any of that. But he knew enough just through 30, and this chiropractor had been in business 50 years. He just knew through 50 years of experience more things of what to say and more things of what not to say. And so you can't wait around for 50 years to learn that. So again, we teach this in very specifics, exactly what to say and how to say it. But the whole point of this presentation was to put high emphasis on the difference between advertising, how many people you're going to have to get in front of and how much money you're going to have to spend to get in front of such a small number of people who are looking versus a massive amount of people who have a problem. And if you just know how to say the right thing, in other words, establish need a little bit, minimize the obstacles a little bit, preferably do it in a higher trusted relationship, you get a lot of business. There's a ton of business there. But remember, they're not looking for a chiropractor, but they have the need. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes to show this disparity. And this is what makes the difference between businesses and chiropractors getting rich and chiropractors going broke, or chiropractors just getting by. That's what makes all this difference. In 77 offices, I've only had one office, only one, that I knew market forces were going to give me more business than I could physically handle in that office. And only one. And remember, on the S-curve, there's only 2 times that you cannot know anything about educational sales and be busy, physically busier than you can be. And number one is if you're the only provider for that product or service in that geographic radius of draw. And that happened with one office. I opened an office in a county of 7,000, a real rural agricultural county of 7,000 people, and there was no chiropractors in the county. Well, I knew 8% of those people were going to the next county for their care. So I knew location was the number one reason people will pick a chiropractor. So I knew as soon as I put an office in that county, I knew I was going to get 8%, and it wouldn't be 8%. 3% would stay loyal to whoever they were. But I knew I was going to get 95% of those people just because I was now closer and more in their backyard, because location was the primary factor. That was only one office, and that office was in a town of 300. I mean, how many of you would open an office in a town of 300? Well, I knew it would do well just because of the geographics and the psychographics and the stats and the ratios. And within 12 weeks, he was seeing 150 visits a week, 150 visits a week. Immediately, it just started bringing in business. And so, and they knew this when they were getting ready to open the chiropractic school in Florida. They knew X amount of people in Florida left Florida to go up north to go to chiropractic schools before there were any chiropractic schools. They knew if they just put one down here, that X amount of those people would immediately stay. That would be automatic business without any sales whatsoever. And that's exactly what happened. Now, unfortunately, when that does happen, then everybody else jumps into the market. When they see that you're doing a ton of business, then you get the next guy and the next guy, and that scenario doesn't last very long. And the other scenario is when the market goes up. In other words, it goes past what's called Morgan's Law. You go past the 10% in any product or service, and that hasn't happened in chiropractic, and it's not going to happen in chiropractic. And so right in the beginning of that S-curve, as it goes past 10%, there's a lot of people wanting that exponentially product or service with not as many providers, and that's when those people get rich also, and then immediately everybody else jumps into the market. Those are the only two spots when you can be absolutely ignorant of educational sales and be physically more busy than you can handle. Those are the only two, and I don't know of any that exist in chiropractic. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to create some clarity on this. Yes, there's business everywhere. And what's the comparison and contrast of advertising versus educational sales? Well, you got to spend a lot of time and money for a little bit of new patients here, and over here there's a ton of business that is constantly in front of you every day through your existing patients, their family members, friends, your circle of influence. And that's where there needs to be a tremendous amount of focus, is right in that inner circle of influence. And that's why. And that's how it's broken down. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes to do the comparison and contrast of the potential business with specificity.